President of Asia Society, in this role for barely over a year. And I can't tell you how excited I am about having my guest here for this conversation. I would like to thank Dini and Asha Dimitri for their support for this Viewpoint series. With their generous support, we're able to bring to you this conversation, which is an annual series where we engage very prominent visionary figures on the stage to interview them about their work, career, and relationship with Asia. So thank you. I think you're here, Dini and Aisha. Thank you so much for this wonderful support. We're also closely collaborating with Pratham USA, which Dini leads for this night's program, and we thank for their close cooperation. Pratham USA is a leading global education nonprofit delivering high-quality solutions to schooling and training challenges toward award-winning evidence-based programs. So now our speaker tonight. I am just so thrilled to have Fareed Zakaria here with me to discuss his book, a bestseller from last year, Age of Revolutions, Progress and Backlash from 16,000 to Present. Fareed needs no introduction. If there was anybody who needed no introduction, it would be Fareed. But if you want to find out the details, it's all here in the flyer. So I'll let you read that. But he is one of the most widely read, seen, and listened to writer, journalists, and thought leaders, not just in the United States, but around the world. In particular, for those of us who've made a career in international relations, foreign policy, his work has been a must to read and to listen to. And I've been one of those career foreign policy experts. And I am very empowered to say that, in fact, this is the first time I am meeting and discussing in a conversation with Fareed Zakaria. I take that as my rather mediocre presence in the larger foreign policy community, but here I have my first chance to meet Fareed in person. Actually, when I was Foreign Minister of South Korea, your team had contacted me for an interview. The timing didn't work out, and so it didn't happen. But I have to say, I was rather relieved that it didn't happen, because engaging with Fareed in these issues requires a different length of intellectual strength and depth, I feel. So I was rather relieved, I have to confess.
Well,
but here you are.
Can I just say it's a huge pleasure to meet you for the first time. And we did very much want to have you on the show. I will note that the last South Korean we had on the show was the president of South Korea, who very quickly subsequently was impeached. So maybe you did the right thing.
Well, as long as you're not the president, maybe you eliminate that possibility. But so thank you. Fareed, any opening remarks from you aside from that?
No. Just delighted to be here. Always been such a fan of the Asia Society. And for those of you who don't know what Pratham does, it's really probably the best charity operating in India. And it's very kind of you all to come here and support it in one way or the other.
Great, wonderful. So I will have this conversation with Fareed for about 40 minutes, I believe, and we'll have an opportunity to take questions, one or two from the audience. We're here to talk about your book, which was a huge bestseller. I must say I've learned a great deal. It is so sweeping, but also very detailed, and lots of historical facts that I certainly didn't know about during these revolutionary eras in many key Western countries. So here's the book. But then, what's happened during the 6 months and your very timely, responsive observations to these developments on your weekly CNA and GPS, your weekly columns, they have also been hugely helpful because you not only analyze the events, but you provide the historical context. So the book, one thing, but you have your weekly observations. So I thought I'd take a little bit of a middle way, not doing the weekly conversations here, but taking a few steps back and taking a slightly longer term perspective in this conversation. So not to go back to the US-China relations as the main topic, which is the main topic, it seems, on every talk show these days. Good news coming out of the weekend from Geneva that there is a deal, which I think a huge sigh of relief all around. At least we have 90 days of reprieve. But overall, you give your take, my take, on a weekly basis. But looking at the past 6 months, half a year, and all that has happened, and certainly lots has happened, what is your take now about the past 6 months?
It's a great question, and to what extent, in a sense, would the book be different if I had written it now? I think that the core thesis of the book is that we have gone through and are still going through a period of extraordinary revolutionary change, economically, technologically, and culturally. And that when you look historically, when these kind of things happen, there's almost always a backlash. And the backlash often takes the form of a cultural backlash, but a backlash really against the whole project of kind of globalization and the technological revolutions and the cultural revolutions. There's a whole bunch of people who feel understandably overwhelmed and uncertain and say, stop the train, I want to get off, And I think what we are seeing in the second Trump term is a very powerful vindication of this, frankly. Because I think what you see in the second Trump term is actually, it's almost as though this is not the second Trump administration, the second Trump term. It's a whole new administration that is much more ideological and much more, if you will, dedicated to that idea of a backlash. So if you look at the fury with which, the pace and fury with which the Trump administration 2.0 has gone about, if you think about all those areas I mentioned, they are radically transforming the globalized world that was set up really in 1945 and then dramatically expanded in the 1990s. If you think about geopolitically, the role of the United States, there's a very powerful effort to reshape America's relationship with the world. If you think about the open world economy, the tariffs, but then look at the internal radicalism, the assault on the American state itself, everything from the NIH to the NSF. These are the kind of crown jewels of America's scientific establishment. Harvard University, USAID, leading law firms. In a very real sense, what you're seeing is a kind of American version of China's Cultural Revolution. You're seeing an effort to uproot the old structure, again, that flourished and in some ways came to power over these last 3 decades. We've had, part of what's going on here is a culture war, but it's even a class war against what is seen as a urban, liberal, cosmopolitan, educated elite who have been running things for too long. And so what I've been struck by is the real ideological component to all of this, that there is a real effort to say, we want to attack all of it. And from a Republican administration, it's so important when I talk about how in the book, the old left-right divide doesn't make any sense anymore. Think about this. Here you have a Republican administration, for those of us old enough to remember, against free trade, against, to a large extent, big business, attacking the pharma companies this week, against the CIA, which it regards as part of the deep state, against the FBI, which it regards as a part of the deep state, against the science and things like that. It's a very, very peculiar kind of ideology until you think about it in the terms I describe in the book, where there's sort of one group of people now who want a world that is more open. Open trade, open culture, open, so that would be more trade, immigration, multiculturalism, a certain kind of urban, open world. And the other side is saying, no, there's too much openness. We need to close it down in various ways. We need to, close immigration, close trade, close culture even. So much of this is, in my opinion, a kind of cultural backlash. So to me, it's been actually surprising the degree to which Trump 2.0 has turned out to be very different from 1.0. Final thought, why is that happening? I think we now see that in the first Trump administration, I don't think he really thought he was going to win. And so he came in fairly unprepared. We know this because he had asked Chris Christie to do the transition work for him. And then when he gets elected, somebody points out to him that Chris Christie put his father and his son-in-law's father, his brother-in-law, I don't know what one would call that relationship, but Charles Kushner, into jail. And so this was surely not a person you could trust. And so he junked the whole Chris Christie transition plan. And then they had to figure out something. And they ended up relying on two sets of people. One was the old Republican establishment, the Reince Priebus's of the world, the Rex Tillersons of the world, the Gary Cohns of the world, Steve Mnuchin. These are Goldman Sachs bankers, Exxon CEOs, chairman of the RNC. This is the old Republican Party. And the other was a group of generals. He appoints 5 generals in the first term. And in economic policy and in foreign policy, you can see how those groups actually restrained Trump very substantially. Now he's unchained. There are no generals, and there are no people from Goldman Sachs.
And you frame that as backlash, a particularly fierce, powerful, untamed backlash. But the idea of backlash is that the larger trend will stay. The backlash is difficult, but in the end, we'll get back on the longer-term historical trend toward greater openness, greater interdependencies. Is that the assumption?
So you ask the million-dollar question. I mean, historically, most of the time, that is what's happened. But sometimes the backlash can be very severe and take a very long time. Mao's Cultural Revolution lasts for 10 years, almost. In fact, by some measures, if you start the reforms at 1981, 82, which is really when they really begin, it goes from 66 to 82. I mean, the backlash that produces fascism in Europe lasts for a long time. So sometimes these backlashes, can be quite overwhelming, and they can be so disruptive that even if they get spent, they've set in motion a set of reactions that have a kind of self-sustaining life of their own. So the way I look at it is there's two possibilities. One, that what we end up with is just what you described, a kind of rattling of the cage, a modification, so we'll crack down on immigration. We'll have levels of tariffs that are frankly the highest we've had in a century, but still within a more globalized world. Look at the China deal, right? So we're not going to have 145% tariffs. We're at 30. We might even get down to 10 with China because, frankly, the 20% addition is for fentanyl, which the Chinese will surely find some way to demonstrate their seriousness about. And so you can imagine it coming down. With the rest of the world, the British deal suggests it's going to be 10%. Now, that's 4 times higher than what tariffs were when Donald Trump was elected. They were 2.5%. But that's a manageable world. Immigration restrictions, making it harder for people to, it's a manageable world. But what if these things spiral out of control? You know, what if you don't actually end up there? What if you end up with a much more substantial decoupling of the Chinese and US economies? What if then that makes the Chinese, to give you one example, say, what was restraining us from taking back Taiwan was the fear of being decoupled from the American economy. If we're going to be decoupled from the American economy anyway, why don't we just, and we're facing slowing growth because trade, of all these tariffs means slower growth. Why not take advantage of that? And the Communist Party gets its legitimacy by saying we finally reunified China and Taiwan. What's the worst they can do, right? The Chinese can prevail militarily. It's a few hundred miles for them. It's 11,000 miles for the United States. And everything we know about Trump suggests he is not going to declare World War III over Taiwan. So you can imagine all kinds of things like that spiraling out of control because of this backlash. And then you're in a completely different world. I worry a lot, for example, of the breakdown of trade. If you have a big financial crisis, I can easily see Trump saying, by the way, this is why Smoot-Hawley happened, right? You had the Great Depression, the financial crash of '29, and America says, we got to do something to protect our economy. And they raise tariffs, right? So you could imagine something like that. And similarly on immigration, there are all these areas where you could imagine things spiraling out of control. So there's a good case scenario, it seems to me, and a bad case scenario.
Looking at the immediate consequences of this revolutionary change in America's foreign policy, I think that the tariff side of things, yes, it's shocking how fast, how furious they've been coming since the inauguration. But tariff was always something that President Trump has said was the most beautiful word. So you knew he was going to use it to maximum effect. But what those of us on the geopolitical front what found truly shocking was his approach to the security challenges of the Gaza conflict, the war in Ukraine. And especially in the war in Ukraine, it has completely turned around Russia's status in the global chessboard from an isolated power that had violated the fundamental principle of global peace to a position of, respect from the Americans, first of all, which hugely empowers them. So Russia is in a very different place now. And that change happened almost overnight from the final day of the Biden presidency to the first day of the Trump presidency. In your book, you call Russia the spoiler state. And that spoiler state is in a very different place now, much more empowered. The Victory Day parade was a showcase for Mr. Putin to demonstrate to the world that he is back. How would you describe Russia now?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting moment because Russia really is a spoiler state. And what I meant by that was Russia is a country, and I contrast it to China. Russia is a country that has over the last 10 or 15 years thrived on global conflict, disruption, and instability. It has sought to create instability in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Moldova, in Belarus, to a certain extent in some of the stands, in Syria. It has been, in a sense, eager to in some way disrupt what it saw as a too comfortable Western hegemony, both of facts on the ground and of ideas. And it has done that very effectively in some ways, kind of punching above its weight. It's economically something of a basket case. It's an economy the size of the Netherlands and declining, even though it's 150 million people and 10 time zones or whatever it is. It's basically a natural resources economy. But that is also the key to understanding this spoiler idea, because when you are a natural resource economy, conflict, disruption, and instability actually help you. What happens when you have instability? The price of oil goes up. What happens when you have conflict? The price of all these commodities go up. So in a strange sense, Russia actually has benefited from a great deal of this disruption. China is very different. China is a country that has benefited from stability and integration and globalization. China is a consumer of commodities, not a producer. It wants stability and low oil prices and low gas prices and low nickel. And, so I've always thought that we don't pay enough attention to that reality. Now, Trump and Russia is its own puzzle. I can only quote to you from McMaster, who was Trump's national security advisor, General H.R. McMaster, one of his generals, who said after spending 10 years working every day with Donald Trump, the one mystery I cannot explain is the hold that Vladimir Putin has on him and the hold that Russia has on him. And I think he meant it genuinely, not in the sense of some secret dossier or file. I think that it's actually more complicated than that. Trump has this obsession and this idea of Russia, and I wonder whether it comes out of the Cold War, and he was a businessman in those days, and he thinks about Russia and Moscow as this grand capital, the head of this empire. He went to Russia, he went to Moscow in the 80s when it was opening up under Gorbachev, and he wanted to build a big hotel in Moscow. So maybe he has this exaggerated view of it, because even, it's the only country, by the way, in the entire world that, as far as I know, was exempt from reciprocal tariffs. It's totally bizarre. And his argument was, well, we don't do much business with them. No, we do $3 billion of business with Russia every year, which is more than 90% of the countries he tariffed, or maybe not 90%, all the countries in Africa he tariffed. I mean, $3 billion is nothing compared to the business we do with China or South Korea, but it's way more than many of those countries. He has always seemed to see things from Putin's point of view. He's, look at the Ukraine, as you say, where he not only reverses the conflict, almost accusing Ukraine of being the provocateur and the aggressor. So I think that there's possibly this exaggerated view of Russia, whereas in fact, as I say, Russia is a declining country, desperately trying to hold on to it's the last multinational empire, trying to hold on to its crown jewel, the way the French tried to hold on to Algeria and Indochina in the 50s, and the British tried to hold on to Kenya. But I think there is a broader issue, which some of the MAGA movement, and I don't know that Trump personally believes this, because he's a more practical guy. Some of the MAGA movement, the Vances of the world, the Steve Bannons of the world, they look at Russia and they see under Putin a conservative, religious, anti-liberal, patriarchal country that in many ways is battling the same forces of European liberalism that the MAGA movement described, right? It's cosmopolitanism, multiculturalism, gender fluidity, all this. And Putin is very good about giving speeches about all that all the time. He's very tough on many of these. Putin is in many ways a cultural conservative. And I think that there are people, and if I recall correctly, people like Steve Bannon or people around him have said things like, look, this is a white Christian nation trying to support traditional values against European liberals who are trying to destroy them. So there is a cultural dimension here where Russia becomes an ally, not an enemy.
Getting back to the war in Ukraine, you can argue about whether it's just or unjust. But how do you, given the current dynamics, there's now a movement towards some kind of discussion, whether it's between Mr. Zelensky and Putin or his underlings in Istanbul, right? It's very difficult to see a just end of the war that would meet the expectations of the Ukraine, of Europe, of the United Nations standards. But leaving aside this idea of just or unjust, how do you think this might come to a ceasefire or an end of the conflict? You know, there was a time when lots of people were talking about the Korean Peninsula model, where it froze with a ceasefire with a big DMZ to separate the two sides, and that ceasefire being monitored by neutral nations on two sides. And that idea seems to no longer being talked about, but what kinds of peace, whether it's a temporary peace or a lasting peace, that might come about?
Well, I think that model of the Korean War was very attractive because you had the reality that Russia was not going to be able to be dislodged from the about 20% of Ukraine that it occupies, and yet Ukraine could not accept, from a formal process that was now Russian territory. It's by the way in Ukraine's constitution that they can't accept that. So it's be very hard for them to do it, and it'd be very hard for the world, the UN, for the West to ratify that, because that has been, as you say, one of the cardinal principles of the post-1945 world. Most people don't realize this, but it's a tremendous achievement of the post-1945 world that we have really have had very little aggression and conquest that has been ratified by aggression in the world since 1945. If you look at the two Yale scholars do this, the 100 years before 1945, there are almost 150 cases of territorial acquisition by force, which is then legitimized. Since 1945, it's maybe 2 or 3 that you can point to, and most of them are even complicated stories. And it's been a remarkable, I would argue, progress that has taken place in the world. So it'd be very hard to see how you formally accept, which is why I think the Korean model was so attractive. Now, what's thrown everybody for a loop is Trump, who seems to have preemptively conceded all these issues. He said, well, of course the Russians are not going to, give back that land. And by the way, those people speak Russian, which is a big mistake to confuse what their language and culture was with what nationality they wanted to be. The Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine in 1992, when the referendum was taken for Ukrainian independence, which passed by 90%, the Russian parts of Ukraine, including Crimea, all voted to be independent of Russia. All voted to be independent nations. In the Donbass area, it was like by 80%. I think in Crimea, it was the lowest number, which was maybe 57% or something. But they all voted by majorities to be an independent country. But Trump says, no, this is all Russia's territory, and they should have it. We should relax sanctions on them. So that's, I think, what's gotten everybody kind of perplexed. Now, I still think it's going to be tough because I think the Europeans will find it hard to do. I think, frankly, countries like South Korea will find it hard to do. This is the ratification of aggression and conquest in a way that the world has really not done. I mean, the reason that the occupied territories are called the occupied territories in Israel is because the world has refused to accept that territorial acquisition during war turns the territory into another country's property or can be incorporated. So I suspect this is not going to be as easy as President Trump thinks. I think the biggest problem is Putin doesn't want to end the war. He's staked everything on it. From his point of view, he can keep going. He's turned his economy into a complete war economy. So I would be surprised. Look, you can always be surprised in these situations, but I suspect that this is going to be more long and drawn out than people remember. And to go back to Korea, as you well know, it took 2.5 years to just the negotiations, and they ended up haggling over prisoner of war exchanges, very small things, but it took 2.5 to 3 years to actually conclude that ceasefire.
I think the conflict dynamics in the Korean War were simpler compared to the war in Ukraine, and of course it's engaged all of Europe to support Ukraine. And so So this is an existential crisis that the Western European countries are trying to deal with, and trying to get as much support they can from still the United States with Mr. Trump. But this is the immediate challenge that the European countries are facing. Huge. It very much depends on how the war in Ukraine ends and when it ends. And what does this do for the European integration project? You all see splits within that integration from the likes of Hungary that has a very different take on not only the Ukraine crisis, but the European project as a whole. So the European integration model is challenged. The Ukraine war throws an existential challenge to that model. From somebody coming from Northeast Asia, where we don't have any regional integration momentum, European integration was always the ideal that we looked up to, and to see that being challenged is a point of keen observation for us. Where do you see the integration going forward, or being stuck, or even regressing after it comes out, or if it comes out of this challenge?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, because the European integration really is one of the great success stories of the world that we probably in America don't spend enough time thinking about. You know, these are countries that were at war with one another for 400-500 years. You know, Germany and France in the 100 years before World War II went to war 3 times, and they dragged the world in twice. But that's, you know, it's extraordinary to think about how that you've gone from that to a situation where it's really unthinkable that Germany and France would go to war with one another. And that achievement really happened because the United States encouraged it enormously. I mean, obviously it was the shadow of the 2 wars, but in the 50s, it was the United States urging the Germans and the French to effect real reconciliation and integrate their coal and steel industries. There were all these efforts made. And the challenge of the European Union is these are really very different countries, you know, with very different histories. And, you know, it's funny. I know this is a kind of, at some level, a silly anecdote, but I was talking to a Slovenian friend of mine. Now, Slovenia is this tiny country, part of the old Yugoslavia, and I was asking him, you know, you guys are right next to Croatia, which is another tiny country that comes. Are you really that different? And he got very upset. He said, no, we're completely different. We're a completely different language, completely different culture, a completely different history. And there you have the problem with the European Union, right? Like each one of these little slivers, I mean, think about it, it's just 2 million people. That's like, Brooklyn is larger than that. But they think of themselves as very distinct. And so when you're trying to build a real single market, it's very hard because you have 27 different national regulations and 27 different standards about all these things. But it always progresses in times of crisis. When you see when it has progressed, it has progressed. Yeah. So in a strange sense, your question is right in that the war in Ukraine poses a big challenge to it, but it's also an opportunity because the war has unified them. And honestly, Russia's threats have been less powerful as a mobilizing force than the danger of American abandonment. So in a strange way, Putin did a lot for European unity, but Trump may be doing more because the fear that you're going to be abandoned by the United States makes you think we've got to get our act together. We've got to find a way to unify on defense acquisition and strategic planning. We've got to find a way to, you know, one of the big challenges Europe has is they don't have a single market for things like technology or banking. You know, Europe is full of great technical and scientific talent. They could easily raise money for companies, but why are there no real tech powerhouses in Europe? Think about like Germany, right? Germany is an extraordinary economy. They have nothing in the information age. The one software company they have, SAP, is 40 years old, and I don't think anyone would call it a top-tier company. Why is that? It's because the truth is, in the digital world, you need scale to be able to be a world leader. You know, you need real scale, because digital world, you need to be dealing in billions, right? Billions of transactions and views and all that kind of thing. There are only two places right now that have the scientific talent, the capital, and scale: the United States and China. Europe has technical talent. It could get capital. I mean, its VC businesses, industry is not as well sourced, but it's a rich continent. What they don't have is scale, because they have 27 different telecom regulators. They have 27 different sets of privacy laws, and that could change because of this fear of American abandonment. Similarly, their banks can't compete with American banks for the same reason. So you could imagine something happening here. It requires a lot. You know, these countries have to accept that they will subordinate their sovereignty to Brussels and all that. And it's happening at a time, you know, back to our first discussion, it's happening at a time of backlash against globalization, when everybody is jealous of their sovereignty. So it's coming at a very awkward moment where the Viktor Orbáns of the world and the Marine Le Pens of the world and the AFDs of the world are saying, we need to be protecting our sovereignty against these forces of, you know, pooling sovereignty and globalization and immigration and all that. And yet, the dynamic strategically requires Europe to actually do more of that, not less.
Even before this challenge, you look at the European integration, ever greater, was it integration or union, and deeper. There was always that popular sentiment that was against that. They saw, you know, there was a democratic deficit to the whole integration, that Brussels was doing things that the everyday people in this country or that country didn't necessarily like or approve. And that sentiment is being fueled by the right conservative extreme voices in Europe at this point. So it was a challenge already. It's being further challenged. This is why I ask, is the integration still going forward in the midst of this existential crisis? Because there's always this idea of the Brussels bureaucracy, the structure, too heavy breathing. And there's all kinds of regulations that hamper companies from doing their work. And so this idea of going scale, is the European project as it is currently embodied in the whole bureaucracy in Brussels, is that fit for that purpose? I mean, you can have political leaders with the will to go the way toward greater integration, you know, greater sovereignty given into the European Union machinery so that you can all go scale. But the way it's currently set up doesn't inspire that, if I may put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, you put it, that last phrase is exactly right, because the reality is very different from the image. So people think of Brussels, and you're right that there is this popular image of this all-powerful, massive monster bureaucracy telling people what to do. In fact, the total bureaucracy of Brussels would be about the size of a small American state. The government, the government bureaucracy in, I don't know, Colorado or something like that. It is not a very large state. It has no taxing authority, and the percentage of European GDP spent on the European Union is tiny. It's like 1% or 2%. What Europe has largely done over the last 30 years is liberalize the European markets so that they become more competitive, so that they become more efficient, so that you don't have essentially hidden protectionism that allows. So when people say, oh, Brussels is going to decide, the nature of cheese, yeah, the reason is because the Italians will have regulations in place that say French cheese can't be sold in Italy because it's not cheese. And the French have regulations doing the same thing to Italian cheese. And so Brussels comes in and says, guys, you can't do that. You can say only the cheese can only be called Parmesan if it comes from Parma, but you do have to be able to, you have to let in the, so that a large part of what Brussels has actually done is break down those kind of barriers. But Brussels' problem is, as you put it, the democratic deficit. Look at places like Poland and Hungary, okay? If you were to go around Poland now, and you'll be struck by how modern the infrastructure is. If you had ever been to Poland during the 1980s or even the early 1990s, this was, you know, this was a country that had been communist for 40 or 50 years. It was decrepit. I mean, it looked very, very beaten down. It is now looks exactly like Western Europe. How come? Did they grow that fast in 20 years? Well, they grew fast, but the vast majority of that infrastructure was built through massive transfers of money from the European Union to Poland, to Hungary. There was a period when 5% of Poland's GDP was just EU transfers of funds going in. 5% of Hungary's GDP, probably a larger percentage of Hungary's GDP, was European Union. And that's basically French and German money, and in the old days, British money going in to lift these places up. And now those very places have these powerful leaders like Viktor Orban and the Polish, you know, the right-wing government saying, we hate Europe, we hate the European Union. Because what happens is, every time you have a problem in your country, you blame the European Union for it. It's the easiest thing to do, right? Like you have too many immigrants, or whatever it is. When the bridge is built, you say, thank you so much, I built the bridge. Nobody says, oh, thank you, Brussels, for all the money that allowed us to build this bridge. So you have a very clever game that politicians play, which is that they blame the European Union for every problem they have. They take credit for every benefit that they have gotten from the European Union. And so you end up with this kind of tragic dilemma. There isn't a good way out of it. You know, one of the things that I've always thought about is that, and this is true of, you know, and I talk about this in the book, this is true of the kind of liberal project in general, which is, it's what you deliver for people is greater prosperity, greater freedom, greater autonomy, greater ability to live the life you want to. It's stuff everybody wants, but it's not very stirring to the soul, right? Like nobody goes to war singing battle songs about freedom of choice and information. You go to battle songs talking about, you know, your ancient ancestors and God and country and blood and soil. And that's what, you know, those right-wing populists have going for them. They know how to use that language better. And so Brussels can't defend itself by saying, yeah, but you know, we reformed the economy so it's growing 0.5% faster for the last 10 years.
Your ability to bring back that historical context and the change from decades, centuries ago, and to compare that with the current, I think that throws things into the larger perspective and appreciate the changes that have taken place. There is another model of integration in Asia, which is the ASEAN model. I had the chairman of the ASEAN Business Advisory Council in our building just this morning. And they were comparing the European model of integration and the ASEAN model, much lighter, much more, much lighter at the overall bureaucratic model of having a secretariat that is really minimalistic for the ASEAN countries. And they like it that way. I think but ASEAN is definitely rising in terms of its geographical, political weight. It is also becoming more important as a source of growth, GDP generation, wealth growth. And you also have then India. And you, of course you have China. So overall, as Europe is struggling, Asia is rising. Asia has lots of challenges, it's very diverse, many potential flashpoints, and we've seen one of them flaring up between India and Pakistan in the recent days. But overall, there is that sense that Asia is rising. And being an Asian myself and working for an organization that is dedicated to highlighting Asia, promoting better understanding of Asia, this is rhythm to our ears. How do you see Asia's rise? You talk about the rise of the rest in your book. That includes Asia and other non-Western parts of the world. Asia's rise is we've had, I'm sure you're good, Mr. Kishore Mahbubani sitting right there sometimes in the fall of last year saying these points, past the center of the world was London, presently it's New York, concentrating on the economic, the trade dimension of a global context. And he says, it will be Singapore in the future, rather wishfully, but not without grounds, because Singapore is such a star player when it comes to economic prosperity. What is your sense of Asia's rise?
Well, there's no question. It is the fastest growing region in the world. There's no doubt that process is going to continue because there's enormous amount of learning that has taken place in Asia. Mm-hmm. So why did Asia begin? Why is Asia in the place where this has happened? There are a bunch of reasons, but probably the two most important ones. In East Asia, you had countries that did not have the curse of oil wealth or natural resources. So they had no option but to invest in their people and to adopt market-friendly and trade-friendly policies of some kind or the other. And so that investment in human capital and the openness to the world economy are probably the two factors that, because otherwise you look at the Asian countries we talk about, they followed very different policies. If you look at Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, Japan, they're all very different. But those two elements are common. The second is that they all looked at success and tried to emulate it. So the first country to succeed is Japan. And then everybody starts looking at, and Japan was really the first non-Western country to break out and to really manage to modernize its economy. And people started to say, well, if Japan can do it, we can do it. There's a very real sense in which when you have somebody familiar who can do something, you say, oh, we can do that, we can do that too, and you sort of copy that model. And so it went. I think that process will continue because you look at the Malaysians and the Indonesians, and they're in many ways trying to copy what some of the countries around them did. I do think that there is an interesting challenge that Asia faces, which is the geopolitical one. Because until now, all that prosperity, that Asia's rise has taken place under the umbrella of American hegemony and protection. And again, we get to the Trump administration. If America withdraws in a substantial way in that way, what does that begin to look like? Then I think you have a much more complicated geopolitical dynamic. Because the truth is, ASEAN, yes, it's impressive and it's but it's really what's impressive is the countries of ASEAN. ASEAN doesn't do anything. It's a very small bureaucracy because all it does is it organizes conferences. The European Union is actually doing massive political, economic restructuring of countries. The European Union is responsible for having transitioned the communist economies of Eastern Europe into Western capitalist economies and liberal democracies. There are rules about independent courts, all that stuff. ASEAN has done none of that. It has no such ambition. So it's easier for it to have a smaller bureaucracy and because it's more a kind of metaphor. But what begins to happen in an Asia without American protection is the geopolitical divides begin to become clearer. And you start to see, and you can see that happening with India and Pakistan in the last few days. But notice the new element to it, which is China, which Chinese weaponry was crucial in Pakistan's response to India. And that is only going to grow as Pakistan becomes more and more allied with China. That is then going to probably, in my view, make the Indians reach out to the Quad and say, guys, you need to back us more clearly and explicitly. And so then that means that, do members of the Quad have to get more involved and more take a side on this? So all of a sudden, you're seeing the kind of eruption of geopolitics in India. And of course, if China becomes an even larger presence and even more aggressive in its policy, then people have to start developing, drawing lines along those areas. I once had a conversation with Lee Kuan Yew many years ago, in which I said to him, why will Europe's past not be Asia's future? And what I meant by that was, if you looked in the 19th century, the fastest growing countries in the world were all in Europe, and they were close to one another, they had border disputes, they had different political systems, and they went to war constantly. As Asia begins to grow, you have all these countries close to one another, growing fast, many border disputes, many different national political traditions and cultures. Why won't they have that same warlike future? And his feeling was that Asia was different because it was able to learn from Europe's mistakes, that it was able to look at the failure, what happened in Europe, the positive model of the European Union, and also he thought the Vietnam War was a very big deterrent, and possibly the Korean War as well, which is of seeing, look what happens when you end up in 10 years of warfare. You just devastate the country, you impede economic growth for a generation. And his feeling was that the Asians would be able to, for that reason, escape that trap. I think there's a lot to what he's saying. But again, I do caution, like we were living in a world, or you were living in a world, with this big security umbrella provided by the United States, and frankly, with a China that was too weak to challenge that security umbrella. Let me spin one scenario out. If it becomes clear he's pulling back, and if Japan says, in that circumstance, we're the second, third richest country in the world, we need to protect ourselves. What's the ultimate protection you can have in the world? Nuclear weapons. And it's not very expensive for a country like Japan. And if Japan gets them, the South Koreans are going to say to themselves, well, look, if Britain and France can have nuclear weapons, we should be careful between China and Japan and all these countries. Do we need to buy insurance? Do we need to have a small existential deterrent? And by the way, we've got crazy North Korea right next to us. And then the South Koreans do that. And again, Japan and South Korea are incredibly technologically advanced. They could do this in months. This would not be difficult for them, and they're rich enough to. And how does that transform the dynamics of the region if that starts? And so I think we're going to go through a very. I agree with Kishore that it will be a very interesting period of great growth, but I think with great growth, sometimes there also comes some turbulence.
And I think for Asia to stay on course and avoid war requires, really visionary and thoughtful leaders like Lee Kuan Yew. And I'm not sure that we have such leaders emerging in the region at this point. But going back to India, you point, and this is all before the developments of the past 6 months, but I think the past 6 months have been, if there was any country that looked good in the past 6 months, it's been India. The first meeting between President Trump in his second term and Mr. Modi looked very constructive. They have teams working on a trade deal now. Mr. Trump says he had a role in brokering this ceasefire deal. Not sure about that, but India is in a good place, comparatively speaking. Asia Society has a center in Mumbai and New Delhi as well, doing excellent work. So I've recently talked to a lot of government officials and business leaders, and they're full of confidence about the country currently, about where the country is going. Mr. Jaishankar said the future of Asia and therefore the world very much it will depend on how this bilateral relations between India and China evolves. And I think the current clash between India and Pakistan and support for Pakistan behind it really paints a complicated picture of that bilateral relationship. But India wants not only to be a counterweight, as you say in your book, but a player in its own, a pole on its own. It's no longer non-alignment, it's multi-alignment, it's multipolar, and India clearly wants to be a major pole. And to do that, it needs to continue to grow on the economic side. It needs to continue its leadership of the global south, which was its big motto when it hosted the G20. So how do you see India, with its challenges along the border, certainly, India's rise is a big part of Asia's rise. Where do you see India in the next 5 years, 10 years?
This is India's moment. There's no question. Because India has, because of really 20 years of consistent reforms, and I think it's actually worth giving credit to we often think about democracies as being so bad and chaotic and crazy. What you have seen in India since really the early 1990s is very consistent economic reform that has only moved in one direction. For sure, it has not been as total and sweeping and transformative as China's reforms were, because it's a democracy, and when you try to do something like agricultural reform and the farmers revolt, you have to go backwards and you have to take back those reforms. But if you pull back and say to yourself, this is a country that in 1990 was basically a socialist economy with a small private sector, and look at how it has transformed itself over many, many elections in which opposition parties have ruled, coalition governments have ruled, single party states have ruled, single parties have ruled. It's actually quite impressive. And it has unleashed enough economic competitiveness and momentum, and there is enough dynamism in the state-to-state competition, which people don't think a lot about. But a lot of what motivates is getting growth going in India is the intra-state competition within India. All of that is enough that even without the kind of big bang reforms that economists always look at, and by the way, that would be very, very good, India is on a move. Now, it will probably always disappoint its most ardent admirers and well-wishers, and its most ardent detractors. India will never grow as fast as China did in its heyday. That is just not going to happen. But it will never collapse. It will never become the basket case economy. It's never going to be, going down the path of so many economies that get derailed for the reasons I mentioned. So, for the last 30 years, it's been the second fastest growing large economy in the world, which is not bad. It's a good, for those who in India, we're going to catch up with China. Well, good luck. China is 5 times larger than India as an economy. And on a per capita basis, roughly the same. It's maybe 4.5 times the per capita GDP of India. So India has real challenges that it has to overcome, but it has this sweet moment. So even the tariffs, if you think about India, is advantaged by the fact that the world needs a low-cost producer, advantaged by the digital revolution and the information age. It's been now advantaged by the fact that the rise of China makes people look for a counterweight to China. But with the tariffs, India is actually one of the few countries in the world that is advantaged, because one of the things holding India back is it is one of the most protectionist countries in the world. Brazil and India could probably compete for that dubious distinction. I would probably give the prize to India. It is probably the most protectionist country, a large economy in the world. And that is at the heart of what is holding it back from being a manufacturing powerhouse. Because a lot of what you need to be a manufacturing powerhouse is the ability to import intermediate goods to then assemble them and put them out. So China doesn't actually make the iPhone. The iPhone is made in 15 countries. But China imports those parts at very low duties and then assembles and exports it. China is much more open to the world economy than India is. Most Indians don't realize this. So if, because of all this, the Indian government were to use this threat that Trump presents and say, okay, you know what, we're going to slash tariffs on all these areas, they would probably, that's the single best thing that you could do for Indian growth right now in terms of a doable set of reforms that would have a huge impact, because India still struggles with manufacturing. It is not an area where India has been able to, and you can't deal with mass unemployment, and India has a problem with this, without manufacturing. For all the, India has tried the services route and it has those huge call centers, but those are all educated people in some form or the other. And what do you do with the vast majority of people who just need to have jobs where they work with their hands? This is, India's economy is in a very different place than Western economies, but that's what you need for employment. So that's the challenge. And then the second thing I would say is, again, back to the turmoil issue. So you're right, this is India's moment. It has enormous opportunities, but it faces a China that views it very suspiciously, and with which tensions have been growing a great deal. So I'll give you an example. The Indians want to get big on green technology. The only way to do it is by importing solar stuff from China. The Chinese dominate solar panels. The Indians are very reluctant to do that. So that's going to be a challenge. Yeah. And the second is, of course, Pakistan, which remains this festering problem, and it now gets combined with the China problem, because China can use Pakistan as a clever, asymmetrical way to keep India occupied and on edge and engaged in this, kind of all this stuff that doesn't help India's growth potential. So again, back to with growth comes turmoil.
That's such, one perhaps a philosophical question before I give our audience a chance. You've observed history, clearly as indicated in your book. There's a interplay between leaders and events, and that interplay then becomes history. So the question is, would Russia be Russia currently if it didn't have Putin as at the top leadership? But then you ask, would President Putin, would a leader like President Putin have been possible in another governance setting? So there's no clear answer to this, but your take on leader versus event and the weight that they play in historical events.
Yeah, what you're asking is Russia the way it is today because of Putin, or is Putin the way he is because of Russia? Right? That's the question.
You can ask that question about all.
Absolutely. And I think, look, there is a lot that is determined by broader structural forces. They give you challenges and opportunities, but ultimately, leadership is incredibly important, because it is the X factor that takes those opportunities and molds them. Let me give you a simple example that isn't Russia. Xi Jinping's China. People always say nowadays, it's become very fashionable to say, oh, we thought China was going to liberalize because we were integrating it into the world, and it turned out it was all complete a hoax. It never happened. Well, what people forget is that from 1979 to about 2010, China did go through a steady phase of opening up to the world, opening up its markets, but also relaxing an enormous number of the totalitarian rules, laws, and practices it had. People in China had much more freedom. They could work where they want. They could, to a certain extent, live where they wanted. There were even freedom, a certain kind of freedom of expression. There were, society magazines. There was a whole bunch of activity that took place in China that was completely verboten under the old regime. And every year it got more and more so. I would go to China almost every year during this period. And every year you could see China opening up more, and you could see it becoming more comfortable and more accessible to the world. And I think that Xi Jinping comes in and he sees this and he realizes that this is a China in which the Communist Party is becoming irrelevant. And the nightmare he is thinking about, number one, is the Soviet Union, when Gorbachev opened up, and it so opened up the society that the Communist Party found itself totally irrelevant, collapsed, and the whole country collapsed. But he was also thinking, I think, about South Korea and Taiwan, where people forget, but these were very tough dictatorships, They modernized their economy. They opened up to the world. There began to be a protest, greater protest for democracy. The first reaction of all those regimes was to crack down, and crack down very hard. But ultimately, it was unsuccessful, and we can talk about why. But I think she was looking at all of that and saying, we're not going to go down that path. I'm going to stop all this. And the way I've got to stop it is I have to actually, it's not just about cracking down on students. It's on cracking down on the private sector, cracking down on civil society, cracking down on corruption within the Communist Party, making China a less open, less pluralistic, putting constraints on China's free market, civil society, so that the party can retain and enhance, if anything, its monopoly on power. Would that have happened if another leader, if you think about the leaders who came out of China, there were all these technocratic engineers who just kept wanting to keep China's growth going. This guy was different. He said, I will sacrifice growth. China has grown the worst under Xi Jinping compared to all leaders since Deng Xiaoping. But he was not trying to maximize economic growth. He was trying to maximize political control of the Communist Party. Would every leader have made that choice? I don't think so. In fact, I think you could have argued that if almost any one of those members of the Politburo Standing Committee had been chosen, it might have been more likely to be a continuation of the Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao rule rather than Xi. Xi was the outlier. But China and the world is very different because of that outlier.
Now, I'll take two questions from the audience. I think Farid just has enough time to answer those. We have to end by 7:45. So if I could have just two hands. The gentleman on the fifth row for the first question, brief, just simple questions, please, and the lady in the sixth row. Yeah, I see you.
It's been fascinating. You briefly alluded to this, but can you talk more about the India-Pakistan situation and what happened and where do you see it near term? Because that could derail a lot of your hypothesis for India and Asia.
Absolutely. So let's step back for a moment and ask, why did this happen in the first place? And I am going to assume that the attack on the tourists in Kashmir was either planned by elements of the Pakistani military or came out of groups that have been funded and encouraged by the Pakistani military for a long time. And I say that because we now have a lot of evidence going back 30 or 40 years, and you have testimony of former Pakistani officials. So I think that is a reasonable assumption. Why is it happening? It is happening for the fundamental reason that has never been solved, which is that in Pakistan, you have, most states have armies. In Pakistan, the army has a state. The state is the dominant force in Pakistan. By the way, if you look at percentage share of GDP that goes to the military budget, Pakistan is off the charts. It's a huge part, once you particularly add in the informal parts of the economy that the Pakistani and the network of retired generals own. It's why you can never do real economic reform in Pakistan, because you're up against, it's not the labor unions and it's these generals who own everything. Pakistan's military was facing a crisis, the kind they have not faced in a long time, which is the most popular politician in Pakistan by far was Imran Khan. This is a guy who went from one seat in parliament to a majority in parliament. And you know this, you talk to any Pakistani friend of yours, they'll tell you, it's extraordinary how popular Imran Khan is. And Imran Khan takes on the military, finally. First guy to do so since, Bhutto in the 1970s. And they immediately essentially engineer a soft coup against him. He's in jail now. The Pakistani military is not popular for having done that. And for the first time, you saw real dissent and dissatisfaction directed toward the military. So isn't it convenient that then you have a cross-border event which causes a rally around the flag, rally around the country, and a rally around the army for bravely defending Pakistan's honor and interests? the whole dynamic in Pakistan has now changed because of that. So if you simply apply that old, Roman rule, cui bono, who benefited from this? It is clearly the Pakistani military. And so that is the heart of the problem. The second piece of this is that India is becoming richer, more powerful, more confident, and is asserting itself more. And that is clearly, you can see that in the pattern of Indian responses over the last 20 years. Initially, there would always be very, very limited, just shelling across the line of control. Then they became more. They would hit military targets. Then it became, military targets, but also high-value targets, now going into Pakistan itself, outside of the area of Kashmir. And now, of course, you're seeing drones going into each other's cities. So I think what you have is a very, very dangerous situation where the Pakistani military thrives because of this conflict. That's what allows them to raise the money for their budgets. India is becoming more and more confident, and I fear in some situations getting arrogant. You can look at the jingoism around this in the Indian media, which is always a little worrying, because it's very easy to start wars. It's very hard to unwind them once you've started them. And then you add to that the Chinese dimension. So I think that we may be entering a very dangerous phase on the subcontinent that needs extraordinary restraint and leadership. And unfortunately, I'm not sure that we have that combination, right now. General Munir in Pakistan seems, he said something 5 days before the attack, which was chilling, where he said Hindus and Muslims can never live together. They are fundamentally different. Now, you just ask yourself, what does this say about the man who is leading Pakistan's military, a country that has 2 million Hindus living in it, right? Forget about what he was clearly trying to, exacerbate communal tensions in India. But what does it say about Pakistan's Hindu population? So I think there's a lot to be worried about here.
Final question from, I think I've already, yes.
Good evening. I'm the permanent representative to the UN for the private sector, and I'd like to bring us back to the US.
What a great job. I didn't even know it existed.
So, employers are really concerned in America about where we're going in supposedly bringing back all these manufacturing jobs, especially with AI, and then the skills deficit in America. There's a statistic going around that the average American reads like a 10-year-old. So, and you're talking about Asia jumping, we're far behind. The PISA results are horrific for America. We have 4 years to bring all of this back, apparently, and make America great. How are we going to do this in education?
Well, you ask a very good question. The chance of bringing back large-scale manufacturing jobs in the United States is close to zero. If you look at a chart of manufacturing employment as a percentage of total employment from 1950, it just goes like that. And it's a fairly simple, straightforward line. You would be hard-pressed to find when NAFTA happened, when China got into the WTO. None of those things had any effect on that statistic, percentage of manufacturing employment compared to total employment, which is the only relevant purpose. It was at about 35% or 40% in the 50s. It's now down to 8%. 80% of Americans are employed in services. Services, and this, by the way, is why the United States is the fastest growing of the G7 countries, because we embrace the future. We embrace the digital economy. We embrace services. That's where the high-paying jobs of the future are. That's the cutting edge of technology, not trying to find ways to make sneakers and textiles in this country. As Dave Chappelle said, I want to buy Nike. I don't want to make Nikes. And by the way, it's actually more complicated than that. We design, brand, market, and do all those things around Nike sneakers in America. Those are the high-value jobs. Yeah, we make them somewhere else because those are the low-value jobs. $200 sneaker, about $30 or $40 is the manufacturing. All the rest is the services associated with it. So it is a you know, it's I would say it's a quixotic venture, but what's sad is you're totally distorting global trade. You're taxing Americans. Remember, even at the 10% tariffs, that's a quadrupling of tariffs for Americans. And it's never going to work. You're going to tax the 80% of Americans who work in services as almost a kind of nostalgia, as an element of nostalgia, subsidize the 8% who are in manufacturing. And Larry Summers points out it's not even 8% because half of those people are involved in sales, marketing, and design. So it's 4% of the people on the factory floor. Meanwhile, while we're having this nostalgia trip to the 1950s, as you say, the real challenge we should be talking about is what do we do about white-collar employment when we are about to be hit by the most powerful technological transformation that has ever happened. Without any question, that is what AI is, and you are beginning to see it in the job numbers. You are seeing college graduates have more difficulty getting jobs. You're seeing, I mean, there's statistics out that business school graduates are having difficulty, law school graduates are having. Why? Because the entry-level jobs, discovery in law firms, spreadsheets, inputs for accountants and MBAs. That's the kind of stuff that AI does very well. Coding is challenged. Microsoft just said it's going to cut 3% of its workforce. It says 30% of its code is now written by AI. That's the challenge of the future, not figuring out how we make jeans and T-shirts again.
Very sobering thought, but I'd like to end on a positive note. And going back to the book, since we are here to review the book, I think it's so much detail. I read it, with my pencil making lines, but there's a line in your book towards the conclusion that said, all of these challenges, the progress plus the backlash, this is all a part of a thrilling human adventure to smash barriers and prejudices and embrace our common humanity, right? And despite all the disruptions of the past 6 months, I think this is something that we can hang on to. And I think that's your continued observations and thoughts that you share with the public will certainly be a part of that. And so with a huge amount of thanks for coming here to spend over an hour with us, to help us preserve that thrill of working towards our common humanity. Thank you so much, Fareed. And thank you.
Huge pleasure. Thank you.